Okay, hello everyone. Really happy to be here today. Um, oh, yeah, really happy for us to be here today, and we're so happy to be joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, just a renowned professor, and like author of over 40 books. It's just like a really pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So, before we get into it, I just want to let everyone know this is a special Black August stream that we're having in commemoration of all of our revolutionaries. And so, originally, I just wanted to do something special for this month. And what better way to commemorate Black August than having Dr. Gerald Horne here? So I just kind of wanted to just give an overview. My name is Khadija. I'm a tenant organizer with Brooklyn Eviction Defense here in New York City. Robert, you want to just introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, my name is Robert. I'm currently a grad student at SUNY Albany. I'm involved with a number of different organizers and activists up here as well. People in PSA, people in Communist Party and stuff. So yeah. And Dr. Gerald Horne, if you want to.
Oh, see, I didn't know you were waiting.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Gerald Horne, writer, historian, activist. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, of course. So before we get started, I just kind of wanted you to talk about your new book, Washington, D.C., Capital of Slavery from 1800 to 1865. If you just want to give us a sort of brief overview.
So a brief overview of this book is that, number one, it fits into a new tradition with regard to Black radical historiography. Not only Black radical historiography, I'd say Black historiography. That is to say, trends in the writing of history. I'm referring to Ishmael Reed, the paramount Black intellectual in the San Francisco Bay Area, his send-up of the Disney come Broadway extravaganza Hamilton, which of course Ishmael puts forward the idea of slavery being a motivating factor for the founding of the United States of America, or maintaining and retaining slavery. Tyler Stovall, a late historian, in his book White Freedom, the paramount Black filmmaker, former Haitian Minister of Culture, speaking at Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes, sweeping castigation of settler colonialism, a descriptor sadly not part of ordinary progressive nor radical vocabulary for that matter. So this book also fits into my previous book, The Counterrevolution of 1776, Slave Resistance to Origins in the United States of America. Secondly, the book itself deals quite a bit with resistance amongst the Black population of Washington, D.C., particularly when they joined the British in torching the White House in August 1814, and then sailed away on British boats to freedom in Trinidad and Tobago. It deals with the founding of Haiti. The state of Maryland, interestingly enough, had its own foreign policy, because Maryland had the largest free Negro population in the early republic, and they blamed the free Negroes for setting a bad example for the enslaved, because they gave the enslaved inspiration that they could be free, so they began to ship them all to West Africa, leading to the foundation of the state of Liberia 200 odd years ago. And thirdly, the book ties into the crisis in Washington, which is rapidly becoming a national crisis. That is to say, Washington is a soft target because it has no governor. It has not two senators, unlike California, for example. When Mr. Trump sent National Guard's personnel to California, two senators objected, the governor, who has presidential aspirations, objected. Washington is a soft target in that regard, not to mention the fact that Washington is one of the most heavily surveilled cities on planet Earth. 17 different intelligence agencies cited, In that city of a mere 700,000, Washington is viewed as unreliable politically by the Republicans. So Washington is being used as sort of a model with regard to a neo-fascist experiment with the residents being treated like guinea pigs. And if we're not careful, many cities will be going down the route of Washington, or perhaps worse.
Yeah, and just like on the topic of Trinidad and Tobago, I'm from Trinidad originally, and I just heard today that Trinidad and Tobago, unfortunately, is mixed up with this deployment of troops to Venezuela to stop the drug cartel. Okay, we know that this is like the part two of the Iran Contra scandal. Um, this is really disappointing considering the revolutionary sort of history and thrust of Trinidad and Tobago history, but
I'm
that's on
just speaking to see, sometimes I wear a Trinidad and Tobago t-shirt. I don't have it on now, but it carries the names of George Patmore, C.L.R. James,
Yep.
Claudia Jones, for example. Trinidad and Tobago punches above its weight in terms of the radical Black tradition. And I should also say that the community that fled Washington in August 1814, their descendants are called Americans, and they're still residing there.
Yes, I've heard you say that, and it's like it's really interesting these connections that are made with the through lines. I have a book by called The Common Wind, and it talks about sort of revolutionary through lines from Haiti to Jamaica to Cuba to the United States. And we really need to understand the sort of breadth of this history. And so I just kind of want to get started. I'm going to just ask a few questions. I know we have you till 8. So I'm just going to start off with this. In your book, Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, you discuss the maelstrom of slave revolts that erupted in the 19th century against the counter-revolutionary slaveholding republic, as well as the outbreak of the War of 1812. And you proceed to illustrate the marked through lines of imperial settler colonialism that course through till today, cementing a sort of pro-fascist garrison class with transnational alliances. Going through this overview, my question is, do you think there's a lack of dialectical understanding? And by dialectical understanding, I mean taking into account and interrogating all contradictory elements intrinsic to political life, both within and without, regarding these historical threads and how it manifests itself on today's left?
Well, I think the problem in the United States is that it has a lengthy counter-revolutionary tradition. And that impacts us all, even those of us who try to be radical, because that means we're oftentimes swimming against strong currents. You know that I wrote a book called The Counterrevolution of 1776, which I mentioned. I wrote a book called The Counterrevolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And I think that that book encapsulates many of the past and current trends that are now afflicting our movement. And in a few months, I'll publish a book called The Counterrevolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism, the Asia-Pacific basin. So because of this rather sturdy and lengthy counter-revolutionary tradition, it has been difficult to develop a sturdy, progressive movement. It has been difficult to draw the kinds of connections that you just suggested in your opening remarks. That is to say, I think also speaking subjectively, and underline subjective, I think that many in the U.S. left, they feel uncomfortable associating themselves with a settler tradition, for example. You don't have that problem to the same degree with the Black population, since many of us, such as myself, for example, were descended from an enslaved community. And as I pointed out in a number of books, by virtue of their objective condition, the enslaved were forced to engage in class struggle. And that is one of the reasons why today some of the most progressive and radical trends are to be found in the Black community. And that's one of the reasons why this community voted most heavily against the right wing in November of 2024. And so I think because many on the left are actually descended from settlers, settlers have a sort of bad odor nowadays. When you think of settlers, you think of those terrorists in the Palestine occupied territories. It's difficult to see that particular community as carrying an iota of progressivism. And so as a result, I think that what has happened is that many on the US left have decided to opt for a liberal interpretation of the history of the United States of America, with the liberal interpretation suggesting that the creation of the United States of America was a great leap forward for humanity. Now, of course, obviously, that does disservice to the indigenous population. You're saying that a great leap forward for humanity took place at the same time the genocide was unfolding. It does a disservice to the Black community. There were thousands of enslaved Africans in the late 18th century. On the verge of the US Civil War in 1860, there were millions. If that is an abolitionist trajectory, as some of our friends on the left try to tell us, I'd hate to see a pro-slavery trajectory. That the investment in the bodies of enslaved Africans were the most valuable investment in the United States of America, circa 1860. And then likewise, when slavery was abolished in 1865, for the most part, the enslavers did not receive compensation for their property. And I draw a straight line from 1865 to anti-communism in the 20th century, because socialism and socialist projects in the United States are oftentimes associated with uncompensated expropriations of private property. Now, we know that when our Haitian brothers and sisters who struck the blow against slavery and helped to liberate us all, that they were then forced to pay reparations to the enslavers. We know that when Britain abolished slavery in the 1830s, including in Trinidad and Tobago, there were reparations paid to the enslavers. Of course, not a nickel, not a penny, not a shilling to the enslaved. Footnote, however, in the first week in September of 2025, the leaders of the African Union, headquartered in Ethiopia, will have a historic first face-to-face summit with the leaders of the Caribbean community, including your own Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados, etc. A high item on the agenda will be reparations to the enslaved, in light of the fact that many of the enslaving nations, led by Great Britain and France, are going through very difficult conditions right now. They're under assault to a degree, both by US imperialism and by the BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And so it is a propitious moment to press the enslaving countries for reparations. So I say all this to say that there are very complicating patterns that have emerged of late. And in that regard, I would like to think that some of the weaknesses and debilities of our movement that you pointed out in your opening statement would take a new direction, would begin to rectify itself and hopefully move in a radical trajectory.
Absolutely. Robert, would you like to add to that or ask Dr. Horne anything?
Yeah, I agree. I'm taking a class where we're just reading through all of Capital, Volume 1. And, my Professor Benjamin, he's trying to drill into us, understanding the what Marx was trying to get at. And Khadijah, you highlight this a lot at times when we speak. You can't just get at understanding the class struggle without also understanding, what we're going to get into, how he drew from Hegelian dialectics. So a lot of people just like to jump straight into understanding the working class day, like class struggle. They try to jump into that part immediately. but you have to understand the kind of totality that he's getting at with capital as a superstructure, subsuming everything within it. And to Dr. Horne, to your point, I think why it's hard to get to like a kind of radical stream of thought is because how the media apparatus works in conjunction with the state in order to have a certain narrative of how the movement of history and capital, in this case in relation to Black people, how these things always work in tandem. So, you know, it's not just like pure journalism over here and like how the state works over here. They're usually connected. And so, you know, yeah, I have more to say, but I know that we don't have a lot of time, so we'll just go for it.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna ask another question that was really great and really kind of gets to the crux of why we are sort of desperate and confused on the left today. My next question is going to be building on this thread of historical analysis. In your book, you delve into the history of Baltimore and the former enslaved populations that were deported at the behest of the slaveholding class for fear of them, quote unquote, influencing the still captive Africans, and they were sent to Liberia. Fast forwarding to today's context, we see the clear parallels between then and now in the light of the demonization and the mass deportations of Black and Brown people, as well as the deployment of the National Guard troops to majority Black cities. Do you think the current xenophobic terrorism of immigrants is merely a sort of different iteration or a kind of code word for anti-Black terror?
Certainly. When I went off camera for a second, I was looking for my Claudia Jones T-shirt, which I thought would be appropriate to show to
Oh,
you in particular.
yes.
I forgot to put it in.
Wow, I love Claudia Jones. I was actually just talking about her last night. Really important figure for people who don't know who the preeminent organizer, former Communist Party USA member Claudia Jones was.
Forgive me for the fingerprints. I had some like shea butter I was rubbing and it got on them.
Oh, you got that shea butter? Okay.
But in any case, to turn to your question, I mean, it's not only the compelled deportations of the free Negro population in Baltimore and in Maryland in general. Maryland was quite unique in that regard because, according to the U.S. Constitution, foreign policy is supposed to be left to the executive or secondarily to Congress. The state of Maryland had its own foreign policy. They set up Cape Palmas, which was a precursor to an extent of Liberia. In fact, eventually was folded into Liberia. And they had a concerted and dedicated policy of ousting the free Negroes to Cape Palmas. Now, of course, we know in 2025, the Tangerine Tyrant is seeking to deport many undocumented workers to Uganda, to Rwanda, to South Sudan, to the nation formerly known as Swaziland, now Eswatini, to El Salvador. And for those who have documents, you should not rest easy because Mr. Trump has floated and brooded the idea that the so-called homegrowns, that is to say, those like myself, whose roots go back to the heart of darkness known as Mississippi slavery, we too can be ousted unceremoniously. And I think that that is the direction that this nation is heading. That would be an emblem of fascism indeed. I should also say that this question of involuntary departure, compelled deportation, and so-called self-deportation, which is also being encouraged today as it was encouraged in the 19th century, that's not the only parallel. For example, we know that during the bad old days of slavery, there was the breaking up of families. In fact, I showed my class the other day You can find that scene on YouTube. It's quite heartrending. The scene from Roots. Recall that was the 1970s multi-part TV series, which shows a family being broken up by the slave master, and it's very good acting. The late John Amos is the father, and of course you may recall him. And of course, we know that today, to serve as a deterrent to folks crossing the border into the United States, if you're crossing with your children oftentimes are taken away from you. And this is quite traumatizing for parents and children alike. The kind of heartlessness, the kind of cruelty that it exemplifies is mind-boggling. But on the other hand, we recognize that given the dire straits of U.S. imperialism, which is facing a ever stiffer challenge from the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, it'll be on display in the next few days when in Beijing, you'll have President Putin, President Xi, Prime Minister Modi, President Diaz-Canel of Cuba, Chairman Kim of the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and other nations too numerous to mention, gathering to mark the 80th anniversary of the victory over Japanese militarism, which in many ways marks the end of what was called World War II. And, I expect that this will be quite bracing for the imperialists in Washington to face, because of course, I'm sure that China will have on display much of its advanced weaponry, for example, which hopefully will serve as a deterrent to the trigger-happy imperialists in Washington.
Absolutely. And this is so really important, because I've also heard you many times talk about on the Activist News Network this sort of parallel to like the revolutionaries in Japan, trying to connect with the Black Americans here and trying to sort of, help them to, foment a sort of revolutionary movement here against the so-called Republican ideals that, espouse slavery. So I'm going to ask another question. In Domenico Lacerda's book, you're familiar. I think you've quoted him, and he's also quoted you in his books as well. Domenico Lacerda is an Italian Marxist, or was an Italian Marxist. He passed away in 2018 of brain cancer, unfortunately. In Domenico Lacerda's Liberalism, A Counter History, he interrogates the foundations of Western republicanism and the celebration of liberal ideals while fervently defending the enslavement and violent subjugation of African indigenous people. In his book, also Class Struggle, Lacerda points out in an observation made by Adam Smith that, quote, slavery could be more readily abolished under a despotic government than a free government, unquote. In your book, The Counterrevolution of 1776, you've also pointed this out, this sort of dissonant logic of liberalism. Why do you think many on the left seem to have trouble connecting the through lines of liberal republicanism as a kind of substrate for fascism?
Well, as noted previously, there is a kind of ideological underdevelopment in the United States of America, which grows in the fertile soil of counter-revolution, I'm afraid, to reference my remarks a few moments ago about the lengthy counter-revolutionary tradition in the United States of America, albeit there is a lengthy revolutionary tradition as well. But I'm afraid to tell you that there are not revolutionaries in power in Washington, D.C. as we speak. There are counter-revolutionaries in power, which is one of the reasons why you see all of these dangerous and despicable moves, such as sending National Guard into Washington, D.C., threatening to send them into other cities with Black mayors. Interestingly, I'm speaking to you in the Detroit area. Detroit is one of the blackest cities in the United States of America, but it doesn't have a Black mayor. And so it's escaped so far the wrath of Mr. Trump. Now, of course, if they elect a black mayor, I'm sure that the wrath will be forthcoming. But to your point, I've oftentimes pointed out, and perhaps this is what you were alluding to, that in the United States, you can wake up even a leftist in the middle of the night and they'll start babbling and prating and prattling about the real and imagined weaknesses of socialism. But it's difficult to find a discourse on the actual weaknesses of republicanism. That is to say, anti-monarchy. You know, I spent a good deal of 2025 in Canada working on a new book. In Canada, of course, the titular head of state is King Charles III, a parasite, if you ever saw one. So naturally, when he gave the so-called throne speech inaugurating the parliament after the election of prime minister, the head of government, not the head of state, Mark Carney, there were protesters, Republican protesters. And as I said at the time, just protesting in favor of republicanism without doing a critique of actually existing republicanism where it has sprouted, where in some sense it had its roots, it does a disservice to your movement, because many of the Canadian masses will say, oh, I get it. You want to have the same sort of nonsense in the United States and Canada. That's not a winning platform, to put it mildly, because as I pointed out more than once, with the overthrow of the so-called divine right of monarchs, initially you had the divine right of propertied men of European descent. And then with the reign of Andrew Jackson, the US president in the 1820s, Mr. Trump's favorite president, according to the Orange tyrant himself, you had an expansion of the divine right of European settler men, generally speaking. And that's called democracy, for example. And that leads to this cockamamie notion that, and this cockamamie notion still exists, not least because it has not been sufficiently interrogated nor attacked, that whatever the majority of the settlers decide, that's democracy. So the majority of the settlers decide that the indigenous should be subjected to genocide. I point that out in my book on Texas. That's democracy, because it's 50+1. If a majority of settlers decide that Africans should be enslaved, that's democracy. And so your questions are pointing out some real ideological weaknesses of our movement. And if we're not careful, we'll have quite a bit of time to discuss these weaknesses in the concentration camps.
Yes, and I often hear you talk about this sort of class collaborationist nature of, this sort of settler class that really is, the stronghold for this movement and kind of continues this sort of fascistic march that we're on right now. Robert, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, just two quick things. So as a literary scholar, I'm reading this book on Cormac McCarthy's work, and his most famous work probably now was Blood Meridian. It's a Western, and a lot of people try to take it out of its political kind of, he's making also a political argument. But a great essay that I'm reading is talking about the Monroe Doctrine, because you said something earlier, Professor Horne, about the founder of the United States being seen as like a great triumph for humanity, without kind of like addressing the eradication of the indigenous people here. And this essay talks about how the Monroe Doctrine, because for those of you that don't know, Blood Meridian is basically a book about manifest destiny and wiping out all the indigenous people to make way to the gold mines for the expansion of capital and U.S. imperialism. But what the Monroe Document allowed is kind of for this kind of gray area where indigenous people can be murdered without redress. So it wasn't technically legal to murder them, but it also wasn't illegal, right? And it was kind of to a point that you were slightly getting at. It was the United States response to England after after the Revolutionary War, right? It was like, all right, here's how we are going to expand our ranks, and here's how we're going to impose imperialism in our own way. Which that shifts me to a question for you. Why do you think that there is this kind of lack of discourse on the shortcomings of republicanism, right? Like where do you see in your scholarship, like the kind of like the genealogy of that, right? If that makes sense. So like, why do you think that this is?
Well, I think what happens is that it's a product of purely abstract thinking. There's this aphorism that I oftentimes deploy, which I oftentimes rather sarcastically ascribe to certain blinkered French intellectuals, where they say, I know what you're saying is true in fact. The question is it true in theory? And so there's this theory of republicanism, which obviously makes sense to a certain degree on paper, but it's not interrogated in terms of how it worked out in practice, how it worked out in fact. And perhaps I would cut some slack to those who think that way if they applied a similar mode of thinking to socialism. If they would say that socialism is great because it looks good on paper, but they don't stop there. They go on to look at how socialism exemplified in practice, and then they take a one-sided view with regard to any real and imagined errors perpetrated in the name of socialism, and then zeroing in on that with laser-like precision, which helps to weaken our movement ideologically and hands a club to the ruling class through which it can bash the rest of us. But once again, I mean, I hope I'm not sounding like a broken record, but I think that it stems ultimately from the ideological weaknesses that flow from living in a country based on counter-revolution. A prop of which, as I pointed out, and as you, Madam Khadija, also pointed out, is that settler colonialism is a class collaborationist project. As I pointed out in my book on the 16th century, when London first sponsored settlers sailing across the Atlantic to what they called North Carolina in the 1580s, it was a project sponsored by the elite in London, but the settlers were a heterogeneous mixture of various class backgrounds, all devoted to the mutual goal of uprooting the indigenous, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, dragging Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free. And that is the origins of the United States of America. And then, of course, those who resemble, figuratively and literally, the original settlers oftentimes are uncomfortable with that kind of history, which then leads them down the road of opportunism, whereby they seek to ignore or to justify genocide against the indigenous, mass enslavement of the Africans. It's really a sad tale, and I would not be going on in such detail, except that we may be on the verge of fascism, and therefore it is well past time to try to tell it like it is and tell it like it was.
Right on. It's very, very true. I want to kind of switch gears slightly. While we're on the topic of like ideological sort of, fracture of our movement that has kind of like given us a sort of myopic view of historical analysis and sort of halted that within our movement. I kind of want to switch gears and kind of ask this question. Many on the left today decry what they believe to be reformist and failed socialist parties. And also, many have deep concerns. I just want to talk here in New York around the Mamdani campaign. viewing it as a reformist campaign with deleterious intentions to obscure the true principles and history of socialism. How do you think communists should understand the dialectical interplay of reform and revolution within our current context? Should we draw a sharp dichotomic line between the two?
No, I mean, as is often said by many who were wiser than myself, that generally speaking, the road to revolution is oftentimes paved with the struggle for reforms. That is to say, the struggle for an 8-hour day, the struggle to have the right to organize a union, the struggle of a woman's right to choose. And as our class and our community go through these struggles, inevitably they come to realize that even if some of these reforms are attained and accomplished, that there is still something missing. And that something missing, of course, is a total radical transformation of society through ousting the ruling elite and establishing working class rule, with, of course, a working class rule adequately supplemented by what some of our forefathers and foremothers discussed some decades ago when they put forward the idea of a revolutionary black belt. That is to say, that once you seize the means of production, that you're still in this society carrying the negative and poisonous legacy of white supremacy. And so therefore, you will have to engage in other radical traditions, such as an aggressive attack against white supremacy. If you recall that the Communist Party was trying to do that in the 1930s when they would have trials of white supremacists, putting them on trial for their various offenses, oftentimes expelling and ostracizing those who were guilty. And so with regard to the Mamdani movement, which you raised, I would say that in Gotham, in New York City, given what we've all just talked about in terms of this lengthy tradition of counter-revolution, lengthy tradition of opportunism, that unique conditions have allowed for what appears to be a breakthrough to the left. This breakthrough to the left is not necessarily going to deliver us the socialist commonwealth, but the socialist commonwealth comes through a number of defeats of our opponents. And the unique conditions, of course, were the weaknesses of the opponents, the sex pests and disgraced former governor Andrew Cuomo, the corrupt incumbent Eric Adams, who's now polling in the single digits. And so the Mamdani campaign, putting forward this idea of affordability, obviously was able to capture the imagination of many. But of course, as the saying goes, you should not count your chickens before they're hatched. There are many weeks to go before Election Day. And even after Election Day, assuming that the Mamdani movement, and notice I say the Mamdani movement, as opposed to just Mamdani the individual, assuming that fails, there'll be another uphill climb to put forward a significant reform attainment, such as subsidized childcare, for example, so that young families do not go bankrupt in terms of trying to find childcare for their toddlers and for their little ones. And so, once again, it would be somewhat absurd to say that we should not struggle for subsidized childcare. We should wait for socialism to come, and then that'll bring subsidized childcare. And in a nation where we've just pointed out has these deep-seated counter-revolutionary traditions, I mean, that does not make sense to me. And of course, we all understand that all of us are subject to critique. I'm subject to critique. You're subject to critique, etc. But with regard to a political movement, we have to look at whether or not this movement does it lead to a step forward. for our traditions, for our movement? Uh, does it lead to a step forward if we can end the political career of Andrew Cuomo and the political career of Eric Adams? And I would say yes. But then after their political careers end, the work does not cease. The work only resumes at a higher level.
Yes, I totally agree. And I just want to say also, I just think that sometimes people on the left, they seem to feel they miss the sort of things turning into their opposite, negation of the negation. They sort of think like, if it's not exactly a sort of ideal as, my socialist fantasy, the way it's playing out, then it's completely dismissed. And I'm sorry to say, that's not Marxism. I mean, we have to like understand the sort of antagonism and contradictions inside the movement, and these sort of tactical critical alliances that we may have to make in order to move to a higher level inside of the revolution. Now, I'm going to say, of course, like you pointed out, Mamdani is not Che Guevara or anything, but I mean, he's, you know, in here in New York City, the rent is incredible. I do tenant organizing. Like, people are being evicted left, right, and center. So if we have someone coming in that's saying it's going to freeze the rent, which is not a long-term fix, we can sort of tactically move towards that and fight for something even more. So I just wanted to point that out. Robert, do you have anything you want to add before we move to the next
Yeah.
question?
Yes, I totally agree. There's a organizing unit down in Baltimore, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, that I pull from a lot. And Lawrence Grand Prix, who's kind of the research director there, he talks about this a lot as well. Uh, he focuses a lot on like uh, kind of like reparations through cannabis legalization. Targeting, trying to find redress for families who have been affected by the war on drugs. And he says, look, I mean, working with the mayor of Baltimore, that's not going to bring a pan-Africanist socialist revolution. But in order to try to address people's immediate material needs, that might, listen, getting people food to get to the next day may help them be able to think about these deeper issues, right? And so while I may want the end of a kind of American state as such, I know, kind of just to mimic what you, or not mimic, but to like reiterate what you said, Professor Horne, that comes through struggle. That doesn't just come through just waiting around. And so I totally agree.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to, while we're just kind of staying on this topic a little bit about Memdani, because we only have a bit more time with you, about like 14 minutes or so. I'm just going to ask this question because I find like it all ties into the sort of historical analysis and kind of understanding the sort of contextual sort of meat of where we are as a movement. So I'm going to just ask this question. On the particular topic of how communists should strategically engage with candidates and electoralism, in Lenin's celebrated left-wing communism and infantile disorder, he actually kind of chides those who stringently hold to quote-unquote pure doctrine, and who, quote, repudiate all compromises. He says that they're making a sort of Blanquist mistake. Within our current political context, how should today's socialist left understand Lenin's warnings and tactics in relation to our own conditions? Do you think that we sometimes have been making the same Blanquist errors Lenin warned against?
Well, sure. And I think to a certain degree, it's hard to avoid in this counter-revolutionary nation in terms of this white rightward republic in which we find ourselves. It becomes easy to fundamentally just accept the lesser of two evils, which of course can be rationalized and justified in the short term, perhaps, but when it becomes a long-term proposition, it becomes a kind of right-wing opportunism. And in fact, I think it's important, in particular in the Black community, which has a community that traditionally, routinely votes 7-3, 8-2, 9-1 against the right wing, to challenge many of our leaders who are not upholding the banner of the Black radical tradition, speaking concretely with regard to Southeast Queens, for example. Someone should challenge Congressman Gregory Meeks of the Congressional Black Caucus, who's been critical of a struggling African National Congress government in South Africa, not critical from the left, but critical from the right. Someone needs to challenge Hakeem Jeffries of your own Brooklyn, who has basically sold us out to the Zionist billionaires and the Zionist.
Torres.
Sorry?
Richie Torres.
Richie Torres of the Bronx. Somebody needs to challenge these particular candidates, because it's not as if that if we challenge them, some right-wing Zionists will prevail, for example. Instead, I think if we challenge them, hopefully we'll help to stiffen their spines, and in the best case scenario, we'll win. I mean, you have to be in it to win it, and if you're not challenging these turkeys, well, then you will not win, for example. So I think that the Black community has a particular responsibility and a particular obligation right now, because as noted, we come from a heroic tradition of class struggle. There is less reason in our community to compromise with that tradition, for example. Instead, we should uplift that tradition. And hopefully, in the process, will serve as a model for other communities to emulate. And in fact, if you look at the bad old days of slavery, that's precisely what happened. That is to say, with the heroism of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and John Brown, and all buoyed by the Haitian Revolution, and ultimately propelled the Republic into a bloody civil war that led to the abolition of slavery itself. And so we're faced with analogous conditions today, except that instead of slavery, we're fighting the onset of fascism. But the principles remain the same. That is to say, for the Black community to be true to our class struggle traditions by challenging those such as Meeks, such as Jeffrey, such as Torres, and telling them to move on over, or we're going to move on over you.
Absolutely. I think it's just so pivotal that we understand that. I mean, Hakeem Jeffries said that he literally can't get behind Mondani because he doesn't know him. Like, I was like, it's like, what are you saying? Like, and just like really understanding the political context. I think like when we think about social movements, I do, I want to be careful about what I'm saying, but I do think we have a lot of romanticized views of, how things should be, and just kind of understanding these antinomies of our movement. They're sort of disregarded in favor of a sort of idealistic way of how we think things are supposed to play out. And so we dismiss people like Mamdani, who I don't want to make the mistake of saying like, he's the greatest thing ever, but I just think tactically it makes sense, because what is the other option? Adams. Yeah, Adams sold us out, and they're still gonna get the National Guard here in New York City. So he just sold us out for no reason. He's just like, it's really ridiculous. I just want to ask one more question because I know we only have about like 8 minutes or so. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about China because China is constantly beat up on. And I think that we should ask this question. So switching gears a bit, but staying with the same topic of reform. Many self proclaimed Maoists on today's left and others on the left more generally often accuse China of being an outright capitalist imperialist hegemon. Additionally, they also indict China for not doing enough to stop Zionist ethno states' genocidal onslaught on Palestinians. What do you make of these claims? Similarly, in today's hegemonic techno imperialism of the West, do you think it's an idealist mistake to expect countries undergoing a socialist project to dismiss the private sector altogether? Do you think people heavily criticizing China are not taking into account how China is supposed to compete in the world market and defend itself against imperialist encirclement?
Hmm. Well, China is a complicated subject, and I come to this personally in the sense that, number one, I'm researching a book on China as we speak. Number two, I'd lived through the era of China's rise over the past half century. This gray hair that I have is not dye. Came from many years of living and struggle. And so what I find curious is the one who's lived through this era, an era where we just saw in the White House the other day, the leader of South Korea is engaged in technology transfer from his country to the United States of America in terms of trying to revive U.S. shipbuilding. The head of Ford Motor, Jim Farley, said that U.S. auto manufacturers will not survive unless there's technology transfer from China in terms of batteries to the manufacturers of Detroit. Now, of course, a half century ago, the technology transfers were going in the opposite direction. From the United States across the Pacific, now they're coming across the Pacific to the United States. And so we've lived through a very important and profound tradition. And I say all that to say that I'm old enough to remember when some of the same folks who were criticizing China today were cheering China when it was in a de facto alliance with U.S. imperialism against the Soviet Union. I mean, as I've told the story, one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed was precisely because of that de facto alliance. Speaking of my project on China, I was just looking at the archive of Leonard Woodcock, who was the head of the United Auto Workers, one of the more powerful labor leaders in the United States of America, appointed by Jimmy Carter, the U.S. president in 1977, as the first U.S. ambassador to China. And then he shepherds the movement of entire plants across the Pacific to China, helping to create this juggernaut. And as I said, at the same time, many of our friends on the left were cheering because they were so anti-Soviet for whatever reason. And now, of course, the China is in the passing lane. They've done a 180-degree reversal and now castigating China. So I guess the line is that if U.S. imperialism is in alliance with China, then you support China. If U.S. imperialism is targeting China, they're against China. Now, and speaking of against, I've mentioned on a number of programs, and you don't necessarily have to watch this because I've watched it so you don't have to. This program from the Hudson Institute, this think tank, they're planning post-communist rule in China, training 10,000 Chinese language speakers, mulling over what to do with 100 million communists in China. They were too delicate to mention in public what they plan to do with these people. Now, I think that this is a pipe dream, but it bespeaks the other point that Mr. Trump is thinking about changing the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And that war, of course, is an emblem of fascism. And even though in war games that the Pentagon has projected, China wins handily, that will not stop these maniacs on this side of the Pacific from engaging in a riverboat gamble to try to roll the dice and overthrow the Communist Party of China. So I would urge many of our friends on the left to sober up, to try to learn and relearn the lessons of history. That, as we said about Sister Khadija, Brother Robert, Mamdani, myself, we're all subject to critique, but that doesn't mean we're subject to being liquidated, for example. I mean, that's a horse of a different color. And so it's one thing to have a critique of China. I just issued one, in fact. And even though I've issued this critique, some have accused me of being in the tank for China. But it's not being in the tank. It's that if a country is in alliance with U.S. imperialism, I tend to be critical. If they're opposing U.S. imperialism, I tend to support that country. In other words, you have to have this larger goal, this larger ambition that's driving your political project. So I've probably gone on too long in this regard, so I'll stop here.
No, that was great. And thank you so much for imparting your wisdom. I know that you have a hard out at 8. I just want to just uplift real quick that on your previous program on Activist News Network, you mentioned that you're going to be a Sisters Place. So I'm really excited because I organized with December 12th movement and Wally. I'm really happy. So I'm definitely going to be there. Is there anything else that you want to highlight?
Yeah, it's October 10th. But tell those folks at Sisters Place, Wally, who I've known for decades, Colette Peen, to make sure they have the books there. Because
I will be sure to let
probably long distance for a book signing.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't mind seeing all the old friends and comrades, but I would like to dispense some knowledge that people can take home with them in the form of a book.
Of absolutely.
So you promise that you'll pull their coat?
Yes, I will. I'm definitely gonna tell them.
Right.
Anything you want to update and uplift before you leave?
Well, I'm doing a book signing in Washington. That's already underway in Montgomery College, across the border in Maryland, October 17th. It'll be advertised on WPFW in Washington, WBAI in New York. They'll advertise it as well there. So rather than overload your audience with details and announcements, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Right on.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, comrades. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
That was great. That was lovely.
That was great. Oh,
Yes.
okay, we're still live.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to go through some of the comments?
Okay, yes. You know what? That's a good idea. Let's just go to this one right here. I highlighted said, I don't trust Mamdani. His father, like Obama, was part of the CIA program in Africa. I just want to say real quick. It's not about trust or not trust, right? We're not trying to be best friends kissing on nobody's Mamdani. What is the problem? Like, we need to be strategic. There was a question that I wanted to ask, but we didn't have time, where, you know, I think taking a sort of historical sort of analysis from Lenin and his support for the Kerensky, which was the constituent government in the Duma, at the time before the Bolsheviks took power, he supported the Menshevik leader Kerensky. He didn't support the Mensheviks because he wanted to be a fucking Menshevik. He supported them because tactically it made sense to support the fucking monarchist party with the fucking czar, Nicholas. You know? So I think, like he said, having these broader goals and vantage point is really important for our movement. Understanding, like you said earlier in the stream, the sort of dialectical interplay and having that sort of almost not quite idealist Hegelian, but definitely a left Hegelian Marxist analysis and understanding, like, you're gonna have these antinomies, you're gonna have these contradictions, you're gonna have these antagonisms. but it's how you move through them and how you understand how they inform your analysis. And that's what's missing. People want to have this very rapturous, very romanticized view of revolution, and just you miss the contextualizing of your political moment. You want to add something, Robert?
Yes, and listen, I wouldn't say to trust him, but I would say, and this is just me pulling from the brothers at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, using and forcing these politicians' hands. This is not like a popularity contest. It's like as you said, Khadijah, utilizing certain strategies and tactics in order to advance forward. Because as Dr. Horne stated, it's kind of the only addendum I would make to something that he said is that it's not that fascism is coming; it's here, right? And so, and they're always and even in our own movements, there were contradictions. Um, you know, uh, people might have been sexist, or maybe homophobic, or whatever the case might be. Uh, but that doesn't that do you just throw out the Panthers wholesale because there were contradictions in the movement? No. Um, and that also doesn't mean to not be
Not interrogate that.
interrogate. Yes, thank you. It doesn't
Right.
mean to not be kind of stringent and militant in your critiques of these politicians. But I do see this as a pathway of opening up other things that can help mobilize something that can actually lead to something great. So
Absolutely. You want to go through like
yeah,
two, three more? You could do
yeah,
it.
yeah, sure. Um, so like just to show, I don't know if I don't know if I'm doing this right. Did
You could
them,
just click on it and highlight it.
all
Double
right.
tap it.
Oh, so just double tap it. Okay.
Yeah, and it's gonna highlight blue.
All right. So all right. I mean, if for some reason it's not working on my end, but I'm looking at something that uh, Kevin Baptiste saying, y'all are saying, force him uphold the very policies that would benefit the populace. Do you want to? Thank you. Yes.
Oh yeah, y'all are saying force him to uphold. No one is saying to force him to do anything. I mean, he's a political candidate. We have to hold him accountable, but we're still gonna mobilize and we're still gonna organize our communities. Whether the fuck he gets up in there or not. Like the point is to we utilize him. I always say, like, I Lenin has this quote where he said, we support the social democrat in the same way a rope supports a hanging man. Like we support him, but the support is critical and it's contingent upon him having politics that can help the masses of working dispossessed people. That is the support is critical. It's not unwavering, and it's not subject to it's just not uncritical support. Our support has to be tactical. What
Yeah.
would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, I was listening to Fred Moulton talk about, and I believe that Professor Horne might have hit with one of the last key figures that he brought up. I was listening to Fred Moulton talk about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers,
Mm-hmm.
and what he was saying.
Detroit.
Yes, in Detroit. And there were also other coalitions that popped up around the United States, black coalitions that worked in this kind of like uh, black class struggle kind of vein. And, you know,
Brittany. I
what's
just
going on.
Brittany.
Um, um, and what he was saying was that the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, they work to unionize. They work to kind of, in a Marxist tradition, Marxist-Leninist tradition, uh, seize the means of production. But they also work to critique the kind of racism that we're in unions, because there was and there are still. And so they internally work the contradictions. And this isn't some like you change the system from the inside out. That's not what this was. It was a kind of ardent critique while also working within the system tactically in order to get certain objectives met. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think you can necessarily, to Baptiste's question, you can't force anything. Like, yeah, like, like just to speak frankly now, they have tanks and high munitions and artillery. We don't necessarily have that, but that doesn't mean that there's a reason why people are scared of our movements.
And I really just, I don't, I had this conversation with my comrade, and he said to me, like, we don't need to support Mamdani. We just need to continue to organize. And like, but it's just like, it's almost like an abstraction. What the hell are you talking about? Like, we don't have any power. Our movement is so desperate and it's so like embedded in a sort of like sort of Trotskyist sort of strain on the Western left in this country. I could get into that, another time. But we just we're we're all melded up and confused, and a part of it is the McCarthyist attacks, and a part of it is that we don't understand the sort of dialectical side of Marxism. And I think if you read Mao's On Contradiction and you really start to see the contradictory nodes embedded in everything, then you understand that, okay, this is an antagonism, but I'm not going to dismiss it, because what happens is that things change, and things are constantly in flux, and they change into their opposite. So what might be negative 1 minute turns into be positive, or it may not even be negative or positive. It might just be a sort of non-antagonism. And so sort of having that lens, which they don't teach you to think like this in the West. I think we just have to like sort of like alter our thinking, or something, like reconfigure how we think about these things. Do you want to read the next comment?
Yeah, but just real quick, because I want to address that real quick. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I want to say also two things. Without before you even get to Mao, I mean, like I said, I'm taking a class when we're reading through Capital. This is why, I heard a comrade say earlier this year at a conference, you read Marx two ways: as a kind of world systems kind of theorist, or a political philosopher. Well, not or, but like you read them as both. And I think a lot of people skip over the political philosophy, particularly because, at least in the field that I work in, because, and I have sympathy for this. He draws from Hegel, and a lot of niggas don't fuck with Hegel for good reason. But it's also important to understand that our enemy is reading us. So we have to read, and I'm not calling Hegel the enemy in like the capital E sense, but I think people might hear like, oh, well, he talked about Africa having no place in history, and then dismiss reading him in order to understand, even if you want to just read him in order to understand Marx. And so I think that that's really important. But I have sympathy for understanding also how people's kind of revolutionary fervor has been kind of attacked. So yes, to Deshay, if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, please call me out. Some people use revolution as they're led to use most other things, as an escape or a way to feel superior to others. But I still think it's a community that is more amenable to a loving wake-up call. I'm not exactly sure if you can clarify the kind of first part. Use revolution as they're led to most other things as an escape. But if you're trying to say like, if you're trying to get at, the point is to like kind of galvanize a community or mobilize a community, I agree. I mean, I try to now as my career goes forward. I try to understand that it's deeply difficult to read, and I think it's important to read in community. And I think that it's very important to theorize together, and that's hard to do. I do not believe that one day we're just going to wake up and then just mobilize and then love will get us through. I love my people. I don't think that that alone in some abstract sense is going to get us to where we need to go. Um, Khadijah, I don't know if I'm making sense. Can you help me?
No, I was just trying to understand the position myself. It was a little bit confusing. But what I can say, I don't know. Oh, there's some feedback. You hear that? No? Oh,
No.
okay. So maybe I'm bugging. No, I was just gonna say, like, yeah, if you're trying to say that people use revolution to be led as most other things, people use revolution as a sort of like escape mechanism or something, or a performative revolution where they just be like, yeah, it's all about the revolution, but energetically and when they speak, that they don't have any vested interest in any sort of actual revolution, then yeah. Love is many things. Love is resistance. Love is fighting for your people. Love is picking up arms, to struggle, like, what the PLO, PLFP, Hamas is doing. That love, actually. And so love is just like, this kind of abstract, a sort of bourgeois thing where we depoliticize love. Love is political, and we need to understand that.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not just love in a kind of affective, sort of cathartic or pleasurable sense. And I love that too. You know what I'm saying? Like you know, I love being cuddly and I love, all that stuff. But it's, as Dr. Joy James would say, it's a sense of political devotion. That's also important to understand.
What this person said, what do you think would have happened if they didn't destroy Black Wall Street? Do you think they would be able to infiltrate it with crack and gangster rap? Um, Maybe this question was for Dr. Horne, but people, I'm gonna say, like, this thing with Black Wall Street, like, we can't keep using Black Wall Street as like a way to is a sort of depoliticized way to also kind of like embolden capital. We just had all these black businesses, and no, we Black Wall Street, it was great, and what they did was maniacal because they wanted to destroy the wealth that we were building. But the wealth that they were building there still wasn't enough. We need a structural change. We don't need a few niggas doing well. We need a structural change. So Black Wall Street is used in this way to kind of justify and glorify black capital. We need to stop that. That shit is dead.
Yeah.
It's really like it's a non-analysis. Crack and gangster rap. I don't know. Like, you can speak to gangster rap. You can take that in.
I mean, I want to kind of dovetail with what you said. I mean, listen, if you want to kind of analyze the kind of brutal and vicious attacks on our communities from the standpoint of understanding how state terror works, to see how Black Wall Street was destroyed is important, maybe from that perspective, but not as a way to legitimize Black capitalism. Um, if that makes sense. I don't think, as you said, a couple of niggas doing well um, is a way that we're gonna get to any liberation. And as far as like the gangster rap and crack thing, I mean, listen, I, I study Black aesthetics. Um, you're not going to get me to deride gangster rap or mumble rap as a way of like listen, if you round up all the gangster shit that niggas ever said on a record, it pales in comparison to what state violence does. Period. Um, you got the wrong person to try to kind of say like, well, maybe we have to stop killing. Yes, we have to stop killing each other in our communities, and we also have to change the structures that are in the words of Frank Wilderson, are gratuitously violent against us. Gangster rap and crack, as far as that's not going to. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense, but yeah. So.
No, and it's like, NWA, like, this was a response, to the sort of Reagan era, trickle down economics sort of a thing. Like gangster rap, it's been, sublated, like it's been taken into capital and turned into something else. But originally, that's not what it was for. So we have to kind of understand the history of our own music as well. It's being used as a tool to sort of lock people into sort of the ideological apparatus of the state. But originally, that wasn't so much its intention. And not to say that, Ice Cube and them had like revolutionary intention, but they were speaking from their concrete experiences of the material conditions that were in Compton and, in and around LA. So we have to understand it as that, and not just like, because then it becomes like a kind of rightist talking point. Oh, this gangster rap and this crack, like we take up a sort of like rightist kind of, conservative talking point about our own history and our own people.
Yeah, and I think that often that is kind of used as really a lot of times like a dog whistle. All these young niggas care about is like, harming their own people. I mean, yes, like and there's a history, particularly amongst the music industry, working in conjunction with the state, of like allowing certain messages to be filtered into the mainstream. But I don't take that as an analysis of hip hop culture writ large. I don't. I think that is insufficient, and so yeah. And as Deshay writes or wrote, haven't read much of any kind of political theory. I'll be very honest. So you'll have to take all of my comments. Yeah, and like that's fine. I mean, this takes years of work. As a person that has been reading and engaging this type of thought for years, I still, bump up against whether it's contradictions or misunderstandings or reinterpretations. It takes a long time, like, and I'm a slow reader.
Me too.
I just, because of my kind of ADHD brain, I read a lot of stuff at once, but I read through everything slowly. So it just takes time.
It just takes time, and that's okay. The most important thing is to just try to do the study. That's the most important thing, and to use your life experience, but to understand it's just not all about lived experience, but to take the lived experience and to kind of turn it into a kind of analysis and a synthesis, so you can inform your political struggle on the ground. And that's what it's about, reading in the theory in the bubble, and or reading to feel superior, or reading to feel like you're better than someone, then you haven't understood Marxist theory at all. This is not what it's about, and it's really about changing the material conditions. But it's also an inward movement as well. I don't want to dismiss the sort of I don't want to be a spiritualist, but at the same time, I don't want to kind of dismiss the sort of inward movement that revolutionary theory has. It really impacts you when you read Huey. I talked about this before, I think in a Twitter post or something, but Huey, in his doctoral work, I mean, it was he was pulling from so many philosophical threads, from Eastern thought to Nietzsche to Hegel to Tillich. He just had a wide variety, and he was really influenced by Hinduism, actually, and it's what got him through the solitary confinement. He talked about that in his book Revolutionary Suicide. So I just think these things are important. I'm really happy that you guys were able to join us. Robert, you have anything you want to share and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of to close it off, like, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's why the people that I've been kind of infatuated with over the last 5 years or so, people like Moten, people like Marriott, like people like Dr. Joy James, their kind of political kind of critique is wedded with a kind of spiritual kind of, like, there's times where I hear Moten talk and he just sounds like a Buddhist kind of philosopher. You know what
He
I mean?
does.
Like, questioning the idea of self. And he's questioning
Joy
that.
too.
You said who?
Joy too.
Joy as well. Questioning the idea of self through a kind of idea of personhood, as he would say, an idea of personhood that has been brutally juridical. Um, and so that's why he's saying that you should question self in the political context, right?
Mm.
And even myself, I mean, um, I was baptized as a Catholic, and while I don't operate in that spiritual modality anymore, um, you know, uh, I still read Jesus politically, right? And think about why he was
That
persecuted.
nigga was very political. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Jesus was mad political.
right.
He was a communist. I often think, like, if like a Jesus like figure was wearing tighted clothes, they would just dismiss that nigga like off the bat.
Yeah,
Like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
all this Jesus stuff, and like, you don't know like the political sort of weight and gravity of a Jesus. And so, okay, we can end it there. We'll be having more episodes. We took a lengthy break to kind of think about how we want to move forward with our show, but we'll be back. And I just want to uplift um, Ka, whose memorial was about like 2 weeks ago.
yeah. 2 weeks ago.
About 2 weeks ago, and he was a seminal rapper artist in Brownsville, New York, and has an incredible body of work. So if you don't know who he is, check him out, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind. Peace.
Yeah. Peace.